Here's a question from the June 2011 paper. It's an essay question. The question is, the Munich Beer Hall Putsch was a total failure for the Nazi Party. Do you agree? Explain your answer. Remember, an essay question is worth 16 marks, which is 25 minutes. In 25 minutes you'd be expected to write an answer of reasonable length. So what I'm just giving you here is a quick overview of an answer. As you can see, it consists of 8 paragraphs. There's an introduction, there's a conclusion, and then there are 6 paragraphs in between. And I've also, on the right hand side of it, you'll see there and there, I've deconstructed it into a plan, so you can kind of work backwards and see what each paragraph is about, what each paragraph is doing. So you've got the introduction there, and you've got the conclusion there, and then you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs in between. We'll take a look at each paragraph in detail in a second. The key point I just want to emphasise is that whenever you get an essay question, remember you're given an interpretation by a historian. In this case, it's an interpretation that the Munich Putsch of 1923 was a total failure. And the best approach is always, in the first part of your answer, and I'll highlight here, that section there. So the first 3 paragraphs is you support the argument. Okay, so you take the line, yes, it was a total failure in many ways, and you develop a paragraph approach to that. And then in the second half of your answer, so in this case it's paragraphs 4, 5 and 6, which I'm just highlighting there, and what you do in that bit is you present a counter argument. So you're actually arguing the other way round. So what you're doing here in the second half is you're arguing that actually beneath the surface the Munich Putsch was not a total failure. You could actually argue that in some ways it was a success. So argument versus counter argument, very, very important you do that in your essay, which is a question 5b or 6b, whichever one you choose to do. Okay, so let's have a look in a bit more detail at what each of these sections will do. So here we have the introduction, ever so briefly. The introduction, in this case it's a sort of 2-paragraph introduction. I'll just bracket it so you can see what you're doing in the first part of it, the introduction here. Show knowledge of the topic, just get across the key point that the Nazi Party was in the doldrums from 1923 to 28. In large part this was because the Munich Putsch seemed to cause a crisis for the party. Hitler was sent to jail. When he came out of jail, the Nazi Party couldn't get any support, and you can see the evidence of that 5 years after the Munich Putsch. The Nazis only got 12 seats in the Reichstag elections, okay, which was 2.6% of the vote. You'll see that in the first proper paragraph, it's worthwhile just showing the examiner you know what the Munich Putsch was. It's amazing how many candidates just launch straight into it failed because, and they forget to show the examiner they know what the Munich Putsch was. So the key point you want to make is that Munich is a city in the south of Germany. What Hitler planned to do on the 9th of November 1923 was, using his SA, the stormtroopers, he wanted to march from Munich 400 miles north and take the capital Berlin, copying what Mussolini had done in Italy a year earlier. Of course it was a failure because he never even got out of Munich. The march never even started. Why not? Because the leaders of the Bavarian state government stood in his way. Hitler had been led to believe that they would march with him and they would support him, but they changed their mind at the last minute and stood in his way. So what you're going to do in the next 2 paragraphs, paragraphs 2 and 3, is you're going to develop your argument that it was on the surface a total failure. And what you do here is in paragraph 2 you focus on the short-term failures, and in paragraph 3 you focus on the longer-term failures. So they're linked, they're both about failures, you're agreeing with the proposition in the question, but in paragraph 2 you focus on the short term. So why on the surface was it a total failure in the short term? Well, because basically the march never left never left Munich. It was a so-called march on Berlin, but it didn't ever get going. So Hitler had expected the police and the army to side with him, but instead they stood against Hitler. Hitler was arrested, he was put on trial for treason and sent to jail. Originally for 5 years, but it was shortened to 9 months. So that's hitting obviously some key points about why the putsch was a failure in the short term. In the next paragraph, paragraph 3, you focus more on the longer term reasons why it was a failure. So here you talk about the fact that when Hitler was let out of jail, although he got the ban on the party lifted, for the next 5 years, on the surface the party didn't get anywhere. Hitler was banned from public speaking. The Weimar Republic was doing well under the leadership of Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann. People were interested in listening to Hitler, and you can see the evidence of that. In 1928 there were some Reichstag elections and the Nazis only got 12 seats, 2.6%, less than 3% of the total. Now, at this point, you then move to the counter-argument. So paragraph 4, on the other hand, is kind of like a linking paragraph, a very brief paragraph. And what you're going to clearly point out here is, amazingly, very quickly, Nazi Party fortunes changed. And 2 years later, in September 1930, they got 18% of the vote. They became the second largest party in the Reichstag. Now, obviously, a huge amount of part of that was to do with the Wall Street crash that happened in October 1929. But there were other reasons, and here you're making the point that if you look at the Munich Putsch, it was not a total failure. So you're going to write 2 paragraphs to argue a counter-argument. So look at paragraph 5 first of all. Now again, what they do is they're linked on the theme of the Munich Putsch was not a failure. Beneath the surface they were a success, and what it basically does exactly the same as it looks at the short-term successes and the long-term successes. So first of all, paragraph 5, the short-term successes. What Hitler did when he was put on trial in November 1923 is he used the trial as a propaganda stage to get across his views. So although he was in the dock as the criminal, he actually turned against the prosecutors and made them appear to be the criminals, because he basically said, the government are the real criminals, I am not the criminal, I am just standing up for Germany's honour. It is the government that are the criminals. So he portrayed the government as being the criminals because they had signed the Treaty of Versailles. And he used that, of course, those views were printed on the front page of the newspapers the next day, so Hitler very cleverly used the trial to put across Nazi views, and he got a lot of sympathy for that, and that's why the prison sentence was very, very brief, because the judge was sympathetic to what Hitler was saying and what Hitler had been trying to do. Now you then move into the final proper paragraph, paragraph 6, which you continue on the same theme, that beneath the surface the Munich Putsch was not a failure, it was actually a success. And the key point you want to make here is the lessons that Hitler learned. He realised that you do not get into power by using violence. That was the main method. It had failed. He realised, however, that he had a lot of support from the German authorities. The judge, for example, had been sympathetic. So he realised that the best way to get into power was to rebuild the party so that the party could get into power legally by getting votes. So from this point on, when he was let out of jail in 1925, he set about rebuilding the party, which he launched at the conference at Bamberg in 1925, structuring it into what we call Gaus, each with a propaganda chief, a Gauleiter, whose job was to campaign for votes. Now, Hitler realised that they weren't going to get votes as long as the Republic was doing well. So he said, we have to be patient, bad times will return. He didn't know that that would happen, but it actually did, of course, 4 years later in October 1929 with the Wall Street crash. And so when those bad times did return, the propaganda apparatus had been built by Joseph Goebbels, poised and waiting, so the Nazis were very, very well positioned to take their message to the German people and to capture their vote, which of course is what happened. And that's the point you want to put across as you move into your conclusion. So in the short term, the Munich Putsch was definitely a failure. Hitler was sent to jail, the party was banned, etc., etc. The Republic was doing well. Nobody wanted to listen to the Nazis when he was let out of jail. But beneath the surface, he rebuilt the party, ready and waiting, so that it was a very dangerous propaganda machine, ready to capture the vote when bad times returned, which they did in 1929 with the Great Depression. There's an answer to that question. I hope that was useful to you. As always, the best thing to do now is actually sit down with a pen and paper and have a go at writing that answer. 8 paragraphs, 3 minutes per paragraph. Try and do that in 25 minutes.